Hi, my name is Ricardo Garcia Sandoval, and on behalf of Mariana del Olmo Ruiz, today I will talk to you a little bit about assessing the threatened mushroom species at local and global scale, mostly our experience assessing species in Mexico. Well, basically, fungi are not seen as a species that needs some kind of special protection or any kind of protection, and in some cases even are considered something that it's needed to be feared or need to be eradicated rather than to be preserved or conserved. Maybe because of this bad press regarding amphibia or are inconspicuous organisms or some other reasons. And this has resulted in that conservation of fungal species has been achieved mostly through the conservation of the places where they are located. So the conservation of the ecosystems, special kind of forest, and so on. But this has resulted in some situation where maybe species that you might be especially interested in protect or conserve or preserve or apply some kind of special policy are not included in these areas. In this example, in this map, we have is a map of Mexico. Within the background, we have the tropics, transition, and the Arctic zones. And in these two shades of gray, we have state, private, and federal protected natural areas. And we have the distribution in these dots of species that are potentially endemic polypores in Mexico, and for those, some of these species are not in any kind of protected area. So protecting just higher areas because of the kind of forest or some other or umbrella species or whatever other criteria that you may use may leave outside some species that you might be especially interested in protect because they are endemic, edible, mycorrhizal, or even have some kind of biocultural relevance, species that are important for some cultural and for some ethnical groups, and you may be particularly interested on do that kind of protection for those species. Now, the most useful mechanism that we have for protection of species rather than only protection of the area is this assessment of the uh, extinction risk. And this has been achieved through the known red list and evaluation or assessment of the risk of extinction for the species. Red lists are not the only mechanism to protect species, but are very, very useful, and in some cases are basic or are essential for the appropriate use of some other international mechanisms like CITES, that it's this conservation and international trade and endangered species that it's not possible to be part or use those international mechanisms for the protection of your species if you are not producing this evaluation, this formal assessment of the extinction risk. So, since the 50s, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, has been assembling this red list and trying to find a a way to assess the risk for the different species. Now, the first formal method for doing so was from the early 90s, and the one that we are using now is from 2012. Greg Mueller, in some other of the talks, has been talking profoundly a lot on this topic, so I will not stop too much on this. Basically, the main idea of having this more or less standardized method is to provide the system that we can be used for everyone, that be comparable, and so on, providing a background for the evaluation of the extinction risk. In the specific case of mushrooms, of fungi, there are very few countries that include them in the red lists. In example, in America, only Canada, Mexico, and Chile have formal red lists that include fungi. In the case of Mexico, it is included in this kind of a specific law called Norma Oficial Mexicana, that it's specific, not only specify the list of species and their status for in which they are, but also a method for doing the assessment. And even when we don't have so far a specific method for the assessment of fungal species, we have some overall guidelines that are quite related with the method that that has been proposed and is used by IUCN. And even when some countries, like in example Chile, make their assessments using the IUCN method, some other countries, like in example Mexico, we use some specific or modifications of this method that are specific for our country, and our evaluations are more in the local level. No, so as you must remember, this method from the IUCN includes like five great like aspects that can be assessed for the assessment of the risk of extinction of the species, related with the population, if it's in decline or not, if the distribution of the species is fragmented or not, small populations in decline, or small populations even when they are not in decline, they are very susceptible to some kind of catastrophic events like hurricanes or something like that, and or models that can be used, numerical models that I think that this is very rare if some species has some kind of this model. Now, in some other of the talks, Greg Mueller described it profoundly, and a very good description of the method from IUCN, and also the application for fungal species. So I will not like stop too much time on this. Well, the method, the IUCN method, incorporates different aspects. Some of them might be more specific for some lineages, but also not all the criteria needs to be evaluated or assessed for having an assessment for the species. The expert can use its expertise and trying to ponderate or have some kind of weight for some of the criteria, depending on the kind of information it is available. And this is really the case for fungal species, as described in this paper by Dahlberg and Mueller in 2011. That it's like using or trying to apply or describe more specifically the way as criteria from IUCN might be used in fungal species, no? And there is some other videos and some other talks regarding these specific modifications that I will not like go too much on detail on this talk. Method, it's designed for use the available information. It's quite flexible compared with an example with Mexican method. It's quite flexible and allows you to use the criteria of the experts, like also allows you to use some kind of procedure that maybe might be look like a peer review procedure, that it's also quite beneficial for the assessment of the risk of extinction. It's quite useful. It's a really well developed method. Now, the application of this method on fungal species, at least last week, the numbers were in the whole process of the evaluation. We have a lot of proposed species, more than 700. No, we have some under assessment, some preliminarily assessed, some other assessed, already assessed, and some other already published. About 400, a little bit more than 400 species already published. This is in total like more than almost 2,000 species at some point of the process. And now we know that we have at least, we know about 120,000 species, fungal species has been described. And according with the more optimistic predictions of the number of species of fungal species on Earth might be over 6 million. Now, there is a lot of work to do. Now, an example of our experience assessing species on Mexico. We have this example of the IUCN method, and we had this species, Lactarius strigocipes, that was described in 2008. No, and it's that means that the name has been available about 10, 12 years, and it's recorded and is known only from two localities near Jalapa, Veracruz. Here in this star, we know where Jalapa is, more or less. This is the Gulf of Mexico. This is the Pacific Ocean. And well, Jalapa is, and the area of Jalapa has been heavily and extensively collected since the 19th century, and also Jalisco are the most explored and well-known areas in Mexico. So it is quite likely that what we know about the distribution of these species is what is real. Now, also, there was a taxonomical treatment for the genus in the area in the few recent years, and it could be considered that knowing these species only from two localities that's the extent of the distributional area for the species. That's quite a possibility, and this species is restricted or is only known from tropical mountain cloud forest. No, and one of the localities is in a protected area. In the area is in a suburban area, and it's under heavy pressure. Also, this particular kind of forest is under really heavy pressure in Mexico, and it has been predicted its reduction over the following decades, rapid decline. These probably are the only localities where the species inhabit, but also the possibility exists that has not been extensively searched, and the problem will be a lack of information. This lack of information, it might be trying to be corrected with the criterion of an expert, with with the help of experts that have shared their information and the expertise. Also with the help of some public collections like this, like the microportal or GBIF or some other sources of information. These are really critical. These are really pure solid gold for this assessment of the extinction risk. Now, also in this particular case, the idea was we were suspecting that this Lactarius strigocipes was restricted only to cloud forest, was not ever found in some other kind of forest. So, but how we can convince, or how we can provide enough information to sustain that this species only grows on cloud forest. Well, one was the amount of research that was being done in the area and some other places over the last years. So people was collecting and nobody else found it. But also we have, because we have ITS sequences for these species, and we have a database of species in some other kind of forest like Quercus forest, Pinus forest, and so on. We search for the presence of these species in other kind of forest, and we couldn't able to found it. So also using not only the most traditional and reliable source of information as Fungaria are used or needed for this purpose, but also to have an idea of the species that exist or that inhabit in different kind of forests or localities through the use of environmental sequences. It's a tool that really is very useful in several cases. So with this information at hand, what we did was we were able to make the assessment and find the status of these species as vulnerable because of a projected reduction in the kind of forest where we think it is restricted to live. So because we have this model that will predict the reduction, the severe reduction of the extent of the cloud forest in Mexico due to climate change, we were able to predict this using this kind of criteria. So we were not needed to evaluate all the different criteria or provide information for all, but we were able to find the best quality information and use that information that was the one that on the best quality that we were able to have, and use it for the assessment of the species. So that's an example of what we did. regarding the situation in Mexico, there are red list for fungal species include 46 species. Then, and we have these three categories that are severely threatened, endangered, and under special protection. These categories are not exactly the same as IUCN, but are mirroring in spirit the categories on IUCN. No? So, starting on this paper from 1997, basically the list was assembled and put it on for its use, but include some species that maybe are kind of questionable. Like an example, Amanita muscaria is included in the list, or Cantare lucivarius, that are two of the examples that Greg was talking about the other day when he was talking about how do the assessment of species. No, so the list might have some areas of opportunity for doing better. No, so currently this extinction risk assessment method, MAR or MAR in Spanish, is an appendage to the list, and it's part of the law that was enacted in 2010, and is what we have right now. In this method, in this MAR, is that the one that it's used for animals is the one that corresponds for fungi. Now, some kind of modifications are being conducted, but this is ongoing work that trying to use the plants modification of the plants method for the assessments. But the Mexican method, what includes, it's basically two wide index that you have to evaluate to fitful in order to make the assessment for the species. This rarity index includes information on the geographic distribution, how wide is the distribution of the species, is quite restricted, it's wide abundant, or an habitat characteristics is the habitat is fragmented or not, and some kind of biological intrinsic vulnerability, like information on the genetic status of the populations, or kind of specific biotic interactions, like if it's dependent on some kind of symbiont or something like that. And then the other index is about how much the species is affected or pressure, how much pressure puts the human activities, like an example, if it's a species that is edible or commercial relevance or so on. Every single aspect of this index needs to be assessed in order to have the full assessment, and needs to provide a numerical value. If the value is higher, the species is more threatened. If the value is lower, the species is less threatened. If you don't have information, you cannot put something like, if an example, if I don't have information on the genetics of the species, I must add a 0, and that lack of information will not add something to the assessment value at the end, or to this assessment score. So if I have a species with very low information, maybe I just have information on the geographical distribution and a little bit on the habitat, but nothing on very few information on genetics and biotic interactions, and there is no information about human activity, it's quite likely that this species will score very low, because most of the index will be 0, and we will think that it's not threatened, when the reality is that we have only this kind of information, that it's more likely in mushroom or fungal species, like information from Fungaria and so on. So once the assessment is made, is produced, you can use one of these three categories that are mirroring, at least in spirit, on the categories of the IUCN. There are some other difference between the global assessment and the more local assessment. In example, the one in Mexico is like the amount of information that you're using, right? Because if the species is quite restricted to, or potentially endemic to Mexico, all the information that you have is all the information available. But the species is is living outside Mexico, it's in Central America, Mesoamerica, or so on, you may not have this idea because this local method is explicitly prohibits the use of information outside Mexico because you only want to make a local assessment on the political boundaries of Mexico. Also, the local or Mexican method, it tried to rely a little bit less on the criteria of expert or in the help of experts, maybe because we don't have that many, not as many as we need, and also try to make this more numerical and not that dependent on the more qualitative weighting of the information. Like in the other hand, UCN is more flexible. UCN method is more flexible and allows you to have a more weighting of depending on the quality of the evidence that you have. If you have a lot of information of high quality for some of the aspects, distribution basically of the species, you can put more confidence on that piece of information rather than trying to use all the indexes, no, like Mexican method. In example, an species, Psilocybe banderillensis, described from 1978. This species is known since almost 40 years. More than 40 years it has been available the name. Many people has been collected in the area, and it's only known from very few localities for a handful of localities in cloud forest in Mexico. So the mayor thinks that is severely threatened, and the UCN assessment, an assessment with UCN criteria, considered also threatened, based also on the rapid decline of this kind of forest, where again this species seems to be restricted to live in. Right, so when the amount of information is the same for the both methods, more or less they can arrive on the same conclusions. But what happened when we have this kind of Hilaria liquidambaris is a species that grows in Mexico in Liquidambar stracifula, but outside Mexico also grow in the US, China, Japan, and Taiwan in Liquidambar formosana fruits. So it's not that specific in their ecological requirements, but using the local method, you can think that this is severely threatened, but UCN evaluation consider it of least concern because it seems to be doing okay in the rest of the distribution. So you have these discrepancies when the distribution of the species is really different, is really outside of Mexico, and then you cannot incorporate this information. Another example of the relevance of the role of the experts, that it's not that considered in the Mexican method, is that is an example of this species that is Psilocybe zapotecorum, described by Guzman, but in Guzman 2012, in his paper, he provided the arguments for considering Zapotecorum and species from 1957 as a synonym of Psilocybe barrerae. So this, unfortunately, the distribution of barrerae, including Zapotecorum, extends from Mexico to Argentina, and the mayor provided an assessment for the synonym for Zapotecorum and considered it under special protection. But UCN was able to, because incorporate in a more decisive way the experience of the expertise of people with more experience and time working on the group, was able to find this synonym proposal, and was not worth to evaluate this name or this species because there's problems for its delimitation. So now global assessment may rely more heavily in some cases, in some cases on expert criteria or the expertise of someone else might looks quite argumentative, but and for that reason maybe not that objective as the numerical other example from Mexico, but allows to this kind of cross-validation and interaction in between different people. Biologically, of course, is more realistic because it's considering the world distribution of the species and allow waiting on different sources of information depending on the quality of the information of the evidence. If you have very good evidence on some kind of evidence, you may support most of your assessment in that information that has more quality rather than including information on kind of genetics that you don't have any or something like that. But the local assessment is necessary even if it's like not as realistic biologically as the global one, um, because in some cases you may not have enough experts to provide help, and some other guys, some other of these characteristics is trying to standardize this evaluation and trying to incorporate all the information available. But the most relevant thing, and this is essential for the support of developmental plans and the uses and conservation policies at local level, and also for the interaction with different other mechanisms like this. The global assessments again allows you more a biological perspective, and it's more comparable in between different countries. And the local assessment is even also needed for pragmatic and local reasons. So it's needed to you need to have like this experience on if you want to your species or the species that is from interest from you to be protected, the most fully integrally protected, you need to have it on both lists, and you need to know a little bit of the logic and the insights of the both methods for the assessment, or local and global, and it's needed. Not, I mean, local assessments are useful and need to be done. You know? And also, well, that's the way that you assess this risk of extinction, and this is the story for some of the Mexican species, but also how to know if the species is doing well because of the policies that you are implementing for recovering. This is the logic of having this new guideline for green status species that, as you can see, is as barely new as December of 2020. And this is basically the logic on these green status species is not only to trying to assess the condition of a species using always the same red list assessment method, but using a method that specifically try to incorporate how the efforts that you are doing for the conservation of the species. But I guess that this is for another talk, you know. And for now, thank you a lot for your attention, and thanks to Diogo and Ricardo for the invitation, and thank you very much.